I have a message for you, and it's not going to be a Christmas story, but it's going to be a good one, all right? And I want to talk about the process of struggle. To neighbors, say the process of struggle. And I want to start with another beautiful story. We just heard one, but we're going to tell another one today, a beautiful story from the Bible. And it's a story from the life of a man named Jacob and his journey of finding himself. But I need to give us some backstory because I know some of us here, whether you're a friend that's here joining us for the first time or we have quite a few new Christians in our midst, you might not be yet familiar with some of the stories in the Bible, okay? So before I read you the passage, I want you to know Jacob is a key figure. He's an ancestor in our Christian faith, okay? His grandfather was a man named Abraham and his father a man named Isaac, and they were the first and second patriarchs of Judaism. And he's the third generation that inherits their legacy. So basically, without these three men, without Jacob, there would actually be no Jesus today. There would be no Christianity today. So he's an important figure, okay? But what's interesting about Jacob's life is, technically speaking, according to the practices of his culture, Jacob wasn't supposed to inherit his father's legacy, his grandfather's position. You know, he wasn't supposed to inherit also the spiritual calling that came with their lives that was from God. Because Jacob was actually the second son. You see, Jacob had an older twin brother whose name was Esau. And Esau, according to his people's ways, by birth, was supposed to inherit the mantle of leadership over God's people. Now, this whole story is slightly complicated, okay, as all good family dramas are, right? Because what happens is, because before the twins are born, God actually appears to their mother and tells the mother, the younger son will be the one to inherit, not the older son. Now, we can debate this challenging plot twist from God another time, okay? But to cut the long story short, when they come of age, Jacob, with the help of his mother, who favors him, steals Esau's spiritual blessing and therefore the inheritance of becoming leader over Israel. Esau is so angry about this that he wants to kill Jacob. And so Jacob, even though now he is the rightful, lawful heir, and even called by God's design, we know that because before he was born, it was said, right? But of course, now he's complicated it with his thieving choices, his manipulation. Now, even though now he is the lawful one, he has to run and flee really from his brother, from the people, from the community, from the land where he's supposed to fulfill that destiny from God. You see, calling doesn't exempt us from character. A calling from God, all the Christians here, whether you call it God or fate or grand design, it does involve our human choices. And our choices have consequences. So that by the time we get to the passage that we're about to read, Jacob has been away, disconnected from his calling, disconnected from his people, disconnected from his purpose in life for 21 years. Now, listen, it hasn't been all that bad, okay? Because he has made a sufficiently okay life for himself. He marries 2 wives, has children. Now, he has a terrible father-in-law as a boss, so that part but he does become pretty rich. So it is enough. And yet, such is the nature of our human souls, right? Human beings, we need more than just enough to live. We all need more than just money and achievements to thrive. So at some point, Jacob can't take it anymore. You know, who he is, designed to be by God, calls out to him. He reaches a transformational point in his life where he doesn't want to run from his past anymore. He doesn't want to run from his mistakes, his actions. He doesn't want to suppress the desire to be reconnected, perhaps reconciled with his brother, his father, his people. And so he has this deep, I would say when you read his story, maybe even desperate need to know, to find out if God's call on his life is still there, if it is still his, if there is still hope for that dream. And so, at the risk of failing, at the risk of messing up his current comfortable life, at the risk of possibly being in danger from his brother, at the risk of the overwhelming likelihood that his community would reject him for his past actions, reject him as a leader, he decides to upend his world of 21 years and return. Now, why am I telling you this? Because I want you to understand the state of his soul as we go into our passage. Jacob is anxious. He is risking everything. The okay life he spent 20 years accumulating. And something deep was bringing him to this point that he wanted to just mess it all up. So he sets out with his whole family, his tribe, his servants, everything. And as they are nearing their destination, Jacob gets word that Esau is coming to meet him with many, many men. And so he gets afraid and he devises the only plan he can think of in the moment. Jacob divides his family into two groups with gifts and he sends them ahead of him. Right? He goes himself, we'll send the first wave and then they'll come, then they'll show my first wife and all my children and give him gifts. And then one day later, a second group will come and he will show off his second wife and his children and the gifts for his brother. And maybe by the time the third day I arrive, when my brother has seen all my family and the children's cute faces and all the gifts I have to say I'm sorry, Esau will find it in his heart to forgive what I did. So he stays a distance behind the two groups. But the night before he is about to meet his brother, his terror and depression reaches a climax. Genesis 32:24, it says here, here's our passage. But during the night, Jacob got out and took his two wives, his maidservants, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He got them safely across the brook with all his possessions. But Jacob stayed behind by himself. And a man appeared out of nowhere and wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he couldn't get the best of Jacob as they wrestled, he deliberately threw Jacob's hip out of joint. Basically, he dislocated his hip. Now, if you've ever had a hip injury, you know that it will be very bad. You can't even walk properly, right? 26, the man said, "Let me go. It's now daybreak." Jacob said, "I'm not letting you go until you bless me." The man said, "What is your name?" He answered, "Jacob." The man said, "But no longer. Your name is no longer Jacob. From now on, it is Israel," which means God wrestler. "For you wrestled with God and you've come through." Then Jacob asked, "What is your name?" The man said, "Why do you want to know my name?" And then, right then, the man blessed Jacob. And so Jacob named the place Peniel, which means God's face, because he said, "I saw God face to face and lived to tell the story." The sun came up as he left Peniel, limping because of his hip. And that is why to this day Israelites don't eat the hip muscle, because Jacob's hip was thrown out of joint. Now, there's no way to know for sure, or I can't say for sure, whether this was an actual physical encounter or hallucination brought on by the state of his mind. But I'm not sure it matters, because human beings, our heart, our soul, our mind, our body are all intertwined, right? When we struggle, it doesn't just affect one facet of us, it grips the entirety of our being. So what matters is this is a pivotal encounter in Jacob's life, a pivotal moment in the stories of our Christian tradition that tells us something about the process of being human. That struggle is an indispensable part of our growth and evolution. That the process of struggle is how we find ourselves and we find God. In 2013, there was a Gallup study done on the relationship between stress and a meaningful life. And so what happened was Gallup took a huge number of persons across ethnic, socio-economic backgrounds, and they were asked to rate how much they agreed or disagreed with statements about how stress affects their lives. Whether stress is harmful and to be avoided, or it is helpful and can be utilized. And what they found is that people who had experienced the highest number of stressful life events in the past were most likely to consider their lives meaningful. And people who were currently under a lot of stress also rated their lives as more meaningful. And what they concluded from this study was people with very meaningful lives worry more and have more stress than people with less meaningful lives. Or you turn to the neighbor and ask them, hey, are you feeling stressed today? If they say no, tell them, hey, your life got no meaning. But that's the tension, right, and dilemma of life. We want to run from the stress that we feel, the struggles that are within us, but it is that same tension that creates meaning and purpose to our existence. So today, what I want to do is convince you that struggle is okay, and that it is something that you can embrace, that you can accept, and that when we surrender to that process, it can be one of the most incredible doorways to our truest and best selves. So do you know that and this is well documented by now, okay, that psychologists and neuroscientists have found that there are actually positive benefits to stress and depression. And some have grouped these benefits into 3 large categories, okay? And all 3 actually make an appearance in the passage that we just read. And the first is, I want you to know, struggles we are going through in our life actually produces in us, number 1, agency. Ooh, big word. Agency basically refers to our capacity to take action. Our ability, our individual willpower to deal with and solve challenges and difficulties that we are facing. So you see, in the first part of Jacob's journey home, his first reaction was to become creative in the midst of his struggle. To find a way to protect himself and his family in the midst of a possible confrontation with his brother. He got them together, divided them into groups, prepared gifts, staggered them days, distance between one another and himself. You see, do you know what scientists have found is this, that when any of us encounter stress in our life, one of the first things that happens is our brain immediately directs energy to our frontal cortex, the front of our brain. And because of that, we immediately become more analytical, more focused. Our capacity to solve problems well, especially problems to do with social implications, okay? That means things that affect people and relationships that we care about, you know, things that affect us, that ability to solve those problems jumps. And in fact, what they found, even more than that, is that depressed people actually score better on certain types of tests as compared to non-depressed people. Okay? Now, you might be thinking to yourself right now, no way. But think about it, right? Anytime you have faced a stressful situation, your mind becomes ultra-focused. It starts to race, for better or for worse, calculating scenarios and situations at high speed. But when you are able to harness that power, it really helps to get things done. You know, it's why at the start of COVID-19, this pandemic, especially the first year, people will tell you, studies will tell you, it was a time of immense innovation and creativity. Right? Your ability to adapt and to solve problems skyrocketed. Technology that will normally take you a year or 2 to adapt to. I mean, have you ever seen technology try to be implemented in organizations? Everybody whines and groans, right? But in 1 year, all of you took to Zoom immediately. You were motivated to figure out how to make life in this pandemic work. Even if it meant spending too much time on Grab food and office chairs. Right? You were involved with being kind to others, especially in the first year, concerned about foreign workers in Singapore, finding creative ways to connect with your friends. You see, agency is the first benefit, and also what I would call the first stage in our process of human struggle. Okay, now before you again go, hey, but you know what, this only applies to some people. Listen, many of these studies were done on people in extreme depression and with an actual diagnosis of anxiety. So this applies broadly to all of us. So I want to say to some of you here, if you've been struggling with a little bit of depression this year, take heart. There's something good that even in the midst of your struggle, something is happening in your brain. And with help, with connection with others, you are going to get through this. Because listen, all of us has capacity for agency. God has designed you with an inbuilt ability to find solutions to the challenges you are facing. And at some point in your journey, there will be the energy you need to find a solution to create change in your life. Because the first benefit of human struggle is agency. The second benefit, number 2, is resiliency. So the Bible tells us next in this story that God comes to Jacob in the form of a man, a supernatural figure that Jacob wrestled with all night. Right? Jacob was by himself. A man came and wrestled with him till daybreak. And when the man saw he couldn't get the best of Jacob as they wrestled, he had to throw Jacob's hip out of joint and even said to him, even after that, let me go. But Jacob said, no. Jacob was so persistent, he wrestled with this guy all night, but even God couldn't get the better of him. God had to hurt him so that Jacob could no longer stand, no longer fight with him. But even then, Jacob held on. I'm not letting go till you bless me. You know, there are certain seasons of our life where the struggle is so great, so long, that our agency will at some point wear out. And it's how many of us have been feeling this second year of COVID. If it's not depression at some point, well, probably, according to studies, at least like a quarter to a half of you have felt depression in the last 2 years. If it's not depression at some point, it's at least what Adam Grant, best-selling social scientist and organizational leadership researcher, he calls it languishing. Right? He describes it as this: it wasn't burnout. We still had energy. It wasn't depression. We didn't feel hopeless. We just felt somewhat joyless and aimless. Languishing is a sense of stagnation and emptiness. It feels as though you're muddling through your days, looking at your life through a foggy windshield. And that's the dominant emotion of 2021. As it turns out, guess what? None of us can stay in a heightened state of agency forever in our brains. I wish. Our frontal cortex actually does need a break. So after a heightened state, do you know what God has designed our brains to do next? The frontal cortex starts to wind down, and our brain starts to rewire itself to remember and learn from our experience. So the struggle that we encounter and the solutions we created, it actually leaves an imprint on your brain that prepares you to handle similar stress the next time you encounter it. Psychologists call this stress inoculation. So your COVID vaccine is not the only vaccine you've been getting these past 2 years. You've been getting a stress vaccine. And it might be, this vaccine, it might be giving us some terrible side effects and feelings and emotions and thoughts. And maybe even the more your soul is fighting against the stress, the greater resilience you're actually building up. Does this make you feel a little bit better? A bit more hopeful about what you're going through? You see, it is in our weakness that we develop strength. But let me give you another bit to make this a bit more pragmatic and helpful, all right? An important factor as to how much resiliency we develop, now we all will develop some resiliency, but to increase it using this mechanism, you know, the factor lies in our attitude and perspective about stress. So Kelly McGonigal, who's a lecturer at Stanford, wrote this book called The Upside of Stress, and she found that stress can make us stronger, smarter, and happier if we learn how to open our minds to it. So in her research, she found that viewing stress as harmful tends to lead people to cope in ways that are less helpful. For example, procrastinating to avoid stress. Getting drunk or addicted to gaming or shopping to release stress. Unhelpful to your bank account. Imagining worst case scenarios, all the phlegmatics here. When we fixate on stress being negative, it's actually correlated with depression, with divorce even, with getting into trouble, even fired at work, reliance on all these harmful, avoidant coping strategies. Conversely, she found that viewing stress more positively leads us to actually tackling the source of our stress, looking for social support around us, and creating meaning to our struggles. Building positive stories around it. Now, let me be clear. Overcoming your negativity about stress is not another thing you need to stress about. Okay? She's not talking about toxic positivity. In fact, what she found is this. She found that people whom her and other studies classify as more positive about stress were not people who were in denial of stress. They were actually people who had or had chosen to have a high tolerance for uncertainty. People who were willing to hold two seemingly opposite things to be true at the same time. That struggle is both hard and something we can learn from. And that is what made those people resilient. And that is what helped those people get the most meaning and growth from their life. So it is possible, as you're sitting here right now, to not want stress, and yet accept it as part of your process. Turn to your neighbor and say, friend, it's all part of your process. So again, you might be feeling a little low right now. Some of you feel like your creativity and your innovation are stuck. Maybe some of you do have some hopes and dreams in your mind, but it's like the energy in you just can't get going at the rate you know you are normally capable of. Listen, it's all part of the process. You are still growing because that is what your brain is designed for. But if you can make nuance and acceptance as part of your attitude and perspective, then you are going to maximize your resilience building capabilities and get more out of this struggle than what you are going through right now. So first benefit, agency. Second benefit, resilience. Third, are you ready? Is evolution. We picked such a good name for our community. Endless PR applications. Evolution, okay? Now, of course, if you search for this and Google this right now in site articles, you probably won't find this as the official word and term, okay? Because the third benefit that comes from stress and depression needs to be described, to be understood, and there are so many words to describe it. Okay, verse 26, it says, Jacob said, I'm not letting you go until you bless me. The man said, what is your name? And he answered, Jacob. The man replied, but no longer, your name is no longer Jacob. From now on, it's Israel, God wrestler, because you wrestled with God and you've come through. So what I call the third stage of the process of struggle, God does something unexpected. He renames Jacob. You see, the name Jacob actually means usurper. I don't know why his parents named Jacob that. Because the name literally became his life. But in this moment, at the height of Jacob's struggle with himself, with how his life had turned out, at the climax of what he thought was to come, God changes his name to Israel, which eventually becomes the name of all of God's people, of the future nation we now know today. At his lowest moment, when he had come to the end of his agency, when he was on his last ounce of resiliency, Jacob clung to God to ask for a blessing, and God changed his name. And by metaphor, we can reasonably extrapolate. By changing Jacob's name, God changed Jacob himself. You see, psychology has a term for this. Psychology calls it acceptance. In fact, there's a whole school of practice called acceptance and commitment therapy. Now, the idea isn't complicated. At its most basic level, it's the principle that human beings, we need to accept what's happening or has happened to us in order to commit to change and grow. You see, we Christians have a more dramatic word for it in our Bible. It's called surrender. You see, surrender and acceptance is the first step, the necessary step in making room for ourselves to grow and evolve. Now, there are a couple of reasons why this is so. The first is surrender produces in our lives humility. You see, Jacob had to come face to face with the truth of who he was and what he had done. He had to come face to face with it before he could truly, deeply repent and let go and become the man he was dreaming of becoming. You know, here's what I found about struggle. Truth always hurts like hell before it frees you. And the other thing I found is, truth is not a moment because change is always a wrestle, a struggle before the transformation takes place. One of the quotes that I always hold to when it comes to any growth in my own life is this quote that goes, "At first it is impossible, and then it is hard, and then it is done." But man, from the impossible to the done, it can take years. Because I've never known any important transformation to be easy. It's always required me to fight to stay humble. Another reason why surrender or acceptance is crucial, research tells us, is because surrender, acceptance, it produces compassion. Which we're not talking about here, feeling sorry or pity for ourselves. In fact, compassion, when it's described in psychology, besides that feeling, accepting yourself for who you are, it's also described as the point where you make space for yourself and others in life. You see, surrender, acceptance, it shifts our perspective. One of the biggest hindrances to turning our struggle into our blessing is drilling. I'm feeling a little bit murderous this weekend. One of the biggest hindrances to turning our struggle into blessing is a lack of compassion for ourselves and for other people around us. Have you noticed that tends to happen when you're struggling? Because when you're struggling, you are so hard on yourself. You beat yourself up for not being able to change and to grow up faster. You also make assumptions about people and the world around you that they haven't or will not grow either. You see, it's an assumption Jacob made of his brother Esau. When he heard Esau was coming with men to meet him, he assumed the worst. That in 21 years that they had been apart, nothing had changed. That Esau had managed to maintain that level of anger and rage as when they were boys. Now, I know that is true of a few people in life or a few situations in our lives, people who stay bitter for a long time, yes, but to a very small extent. But more often than not, in the whole scheme of life and relationships, things change. There is no way, at least at the most basic level, Esau, there's no way he could have spent 21 years of his life just spending every moment and minute thinking about his brother Jacob and wanting to kill him. Right? But that's what prolonged struggling does to us sometimes. It makes us irrational. We become desperately self-absorbed and small until we come to a point where we decide to accept and surrender. Well, just to give you a sneak peek of what happens later, Esau arrives, and he welcomes Jacob with tears and open arms. Not only has he forgiven Jacob, Esau himself has found his own destiny in God. God has blessed him with great wealth and many wives and descendants too. Esau is happier not being the one to inherit their father's legacy. He is living his own best life. You see, it's funny, right? When we are young, we spend so much time struggling to be someone and something we're not. And struggle in life teaches us to let go of that, to have compassion, to make space for ourselves, and to make space for other people to be themselves. If only we could learn to come to that point quicker, it would save us so much trouble. Now, finally, the most important part of surrender that I want to communicate with you today, surrender produces connection. with God, and therefore ourselves. So after we read about God changing Jacob's name, comes my favorite part of this story, where Jacob asks God, "What is your name?" And the man says, "Why do you want to know my name?" And then, right there and then, he blessed Jacob. So it's very interesting, right, the order of this story. The final blessing didn't come after God told Jacob his new name. The final blessing came when Jacob asked God's name. Now, God doesn't give his name in this particular story. He does in other parts of the Bible, but not here. Because I don't think that's the point of this particular story and this particular encounter in Jacob's life. The point of this encounter was that Jacob connected with God face to face, whether or not he knew his name. See, verse 30 says, Jacob named the place Peniel, which means God's face, because I saw God face to face and lived to tell. You know, from one intense encounter with God, Jacob was forever changed. And I love how the story ends. It says, he left Peniel limping from his encounter with God. And to this day, Israel doesn't eat the hip muscle because they remember that this was the moment God threw Jacob's hip out of joint. So not only did it forever change Jacob, it forever changed his descendants and forever changed Israel's traditions. So this is my belief about human beings and humanity, all right? That there is something about us that will always be searching for our truest selves and for God. We cannot help it. And both us and ourselves, God are inextricably linked. Whether you want to call that search God or a higher power or a bigger picture or a destiny, for me, it's God. God created us with his own hands and spirit, and he put in us something that longs and desires and needs to be connected, to make sense of, to be fully conscious and aware of the one who created us and the design and the purpose and meaning he created us for in this life. You know, we can do it alone. I mean, our passions hint at that purpose. Our strengths and abilities and personality and experiences clue us in on the meaning of our existence. But something happens within when a human being finds their connection with God. And that connection only ever, in fact, always comes from a process of prolonged, difficult, and sometimes agonizing struggle. Because it's people who struggle who find meaning. It is people who wrestle with that existential question, who is, where is God? You know, it's people who sit in ambiguity and uncertainty that find not just a calling, but a connection. And when they meet God face to face, they also find themselves. You see, the reason why this story is one of my favorite stories is that I've always related to this story. You know, because I'm someone who, my whole life has always wrestled and still wrestles intensely with God and myself. You know, people think you become the leader of a church or religion because you have unshakable faith in an unseen power. No, I became a leader because I'm constantly wrestling and asking questions. Because the only way to know God and to know myself is to struggle. And so I want to encourage all of you here, wherever you are at in your beliefs about self and about God, if you are struggling, you are probably closer than you know. Because, you know, one of the cool things that I learned about depression years ago is that depression can actually be a precursor to breakthrough. If you were to study the brain of a person who is depressed, you will find a brain that's actually preparing itself for new patterns and pathways to be created. Now, as someone who's experienced depression before, I don't want to be frivolous with this information, okay? Cycling out of severe depression does require you to get help that you need. Sometimes medication, sometimes help and support therapy, so please do that for yourself. But alongside that, I want all of us here to know that when we are struggling, when we are feeling anywhere from stress to down and out to low to severely sad, hidden inside God's design for you is a soul preparing itself for evolution. A new, a better, a happier, more at peace, a more aligned you. So let me end with another passage that's been speaking to me personally this year, and I hope it speaks to you and gives you hope for next year. It's Matthew 5, 3-9, and this is Jesus speaking. He says, "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and His rule. You're blessed when you feel lost, that you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. You're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that cannot be bought. You're blessed when you care, because at the moment of being careful, you find yourselves cared for. You're blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and heart put right. Then you can see God in the outside world." So where is our process of struggle meant to end up at? It's meant to end up with you finding God and finding yourself. And I hope that this Christmas, this message helps you get started on that path for your life.